Me years to want to sleep in my own bed. I'd use any excuse to stay in my parents' room. Bad dreams that never happened, a mysterious illness, anything not to be alone. I didn't consider myself scared of the dark, per se. I was scared of what happens when you're defenseless. It was irrational, really, knowing my room was the safest place I could be. It confused me. I wanted it to make sense. So, in my own time, I turned to things that did make sense. Scary movies. I didn't like watching them for a while, painting worse nightmares in my head than before. But the older I got, the more my love grew. It was my favorite thing in the world. The psychological, the campy, any type of horror had a grip on me. The filmmakers also fascinated me. Because, to be honest, a lot of horror movies are kind of crappy. So I wondered, what makes truly good horror? What do you have to do to make something scary, to tell a good story? How does the medium affect it? It nagged at me, not really having the time to figure it out. But now I get an excuse to research it for school. So here's my research for why we like horror and how to make good horror media. Fear. I would hope that everyone watching this has experienced it. We as humans all have a basic understanding of fear. We know what makes us scared and how it feels to be scared. But truly, what is fear? What defines it? Is there a fear we all have? To answer the first question, we don't know. It's still being argued. The Recreational Fear Lab has the best definition I've found.
In humans, fear refers to the conscious unpleasant feeling that one has when in the presence of a threat to well-being, which is often but not always accompanied by behavioral and physiological defensive reactions.
Our sense of fear seems to be directly tied to the unknown. Evolutionarily, I feel like this makes perfect sense, putting us on edge and making us ready to defend ourselves when we aren't sure if there's danger. Another primal fear we have is the uncanny. Most people have heard of the concept of the uncanny valley. It was created with humanoid robots in mind, and our fear towards them. When something inanimate starts to look too close to a human, but not indistinguishable, we start to feel uncomfortable. The perceptual mismatch theory postulates that one of the reasons we feel the uncanny valley is when faces have inconsistent features, like robot eyes on a human, or even just obscuring the face. Look at clowns. Sure, in general you can see their expressions, but their faces are much more difficult to read with all that face paint on. And it's hard to know who's truly behind there. Something I've personally noticed is when people have the incorrect emotions or reactions to a situation, it causes this feeling as well. This is because all of these signs lead to unpredictability, or the unknown. So why in God's name do I enjoy this stuff? Well, because it's all controlled fear. I can switch it off anytime. There's a boundary between us and what's happening on screen. We can pick what we're watching. If I have a phobia of drowning, I don't have to watch Friday the 13th. In real life, you can't just stop the scenario. I have control over feeling scared. I can find a sweet spot between the adrenaline rush and not dying. This is called recreational fear. It's basically the type of fear that you get enjoyment from. Broadly speaking, there's 3 types of people who enjoy it. White knucklers, the type of people who lean away from the media, not getting immersed. It's not because they don't like it. It's just that they're trying to find the sweet spot between fear and fun. They might make jokes at the film, trying to find the absurdity in all of it. The adrenaline junkies are exactly what they sound like. There's actually some really interesting data about what makes people seek out adrenaline. In scary situations, typically cortisol and adrenaline is what release. These are basically the fight, flight, flee chemicals. But for some people, dopamine is released with it too. This makes them associate these situations with excitement or joy. Lastly, dark copers. These people use horror as a coping mechanism from their real life. There could be many reasons these experiences can teach you coping skills, or perhaps they can feel like you have more control over what's happening to you. Personally, the absurdity of bad horror helps me cope. It's so stupid that it makes me feel better. But with good movies, it's nice to have some sort of control over what scares me. It helps me understand my emotions more. So, there's an understanding of fear and why we like it, but how do we make our stuff scary? This is dependent on the medium you're using. What works in a game won't necessarily work in a movie. Of course, if we want to get into the nitty-gritty of this is also dependent on the subgenre, and then the medium you're working with can also affect it. And then you can also look at what time period you're in and the trends that are currently going on in the genre. But that would take like a whole 3 other videos, so I'll just focus on the big 3 categories for me. Movies, books, and games. For each category, I'll pull examples and point out what works and what doesn't. I'll also discuss how they take advantage of the medium. Starting off with my personal favorite medium, film. Film has the advantage of being a visual medium, meaning that the director has full control over what the viewer imagines. When reading a book, everyone interprets what happens differently. We will never truly see the author's vision. This is a double-edged sword, though, because as we discussed before, we have an innate fear of the unknown. This means that the ability to imagine something yourself can actually make it more effective for some people. You need to find a balance between these two. I think John Carpenter's The Thing is an amazing example of treading this line. A lot of the horror is derived from the grotesque body transformations, but what makes this movie so incredible to me is combining those visuals with the underlying paranoia. The paranoia in this movie actively comes from our fear of the unknown, our fear that anyone could be assimilated. And by showing those visuals, we are given high stakes, making the fear of betrayal even worse. If the film did not have the budget for the special effects, it would have failed fundamentally. The visuals are not the only factor though. The film also has to worry about audio design. Soundtracks can work in tandem with visuals to create a unique aesthetic for a film. The soundtrack itself is sometimes tied to the film's cultural identity. Look at Halloween. Most people think of the theme when you mention the movie. Sound design can really immerse people too. The right sound effects can make or break a scene, in my opinion. One element that is lost on people usually is audio things. I feel like they're pivotal to suspense. To quote the master of suspense, there's no terror in the bang, only in the anticipation of it. Using something like a subtle droning sound to build up the suspense, only to get people with a nail-biting sting. That's an amazing way to scare the viewers. However, cheap jump scares are not the way to go. Audiences are used to them, lessening the impact of the moment, or sometimes the film overall. They can be effective, though. The Evil Dead 2 has this amazing scene where Ash is processing the first act of the movie. He is looking at himself in the mirror when all of a sudden the reflection literally grabs him and starts verbally tormenting him. I think it's an amazing jump scare. Not too overplayed, but still shocking with some really good build-up. As for more subtle ideas, A Quiet Place not only has a very interesting idea with sound design, but it also executes it very well, only using the quiet diegetic sounds to build up the tension. When working in film, you gain the benefit of sound and visuals, but there's also many pitfalls you can run into with that. There's actually a lot of overlap between the strategies of movies and video games. The entire jump scare section can also be applied to video games as well. I feel like in video games, it can be even worse if they take you out of control just for a game's jump scare. In the first jump scare of Resident Evil 3 Remake, you're thrust right into a cutscene after the main villain breaks down a wall. While it's nitpicky, I would have just rather immediately went to gameplay. Video games have the unique ability to have you control the protagonist, and I think they should take advantage of this, giving you as much control as possible. Being able to play a story also opens up a ton of possibilities for story writing. There are a lot of stories that would only ever work in a video game. I don't think Silent Hill PT would ever work in another medium. It relies on the environment literally changing around the player. If it were a movie, the environment would have to change around the protagonist. It adds another step between you and the horror. Games also need your full attention. You can't just put it on in the background like a movie. You need to be focused, sometimes hyper-focused if the mechanics rely on sound. In FNAF 4, the only way to know that the animatronics are in the hallway is to listen for them. You also need to be immersed to play a game. This can be reflected in the controls. In Iron Lung, the only input you have is a camera and the ability to change coordinates. Personally, this does not cheapen the experience. It makes me feel like I'm just some random person forced into a sup. I also like the limited inventory in survival horror, mainly Resident Evil. This feature puts so much more pressure on the player to be able to manage your resources, choosing what to take and what to leave. Lastly, my personal favorite era of horror games was the late 90s to 2000s. Silent Hill is one of my favorite franchises from this era. I think that the visuals of those games, especially the second, actually benefit from the lower quality of the devices that they were on. The fog that is present in all the games, looming over the town, leaving everything in shadows, was due to the hardware limitations of the PS1. The entire key aesthetic of the games would be gone without those hardware limitations. The second game has still good dialogue, like most of the other games of that era. However, Silent Hill is an off-putting town, designed to be creepy in a way without the ability to put your finger on it. I think the dialogue just adds to this. There's horror in the characters talking about the town being haunted with almost no emotion. It's the fear of the uncanny. Sadly, this benefit of games is lost as technology advances. Its visuals and audios can overlap with movies, but they have the unique feature of player control, leading to completely new stories being made. Last but not least, the oldest medium, books. Now, these lack the visual and auditory input of the other two mediums, but they gain something else. They allow the reader to conjure up any image in their head with the author's writing. This gives them the unique ability to have everyone's individual fear be implemented into the story. Of course, this only does stretch as far as the author's language could go. Stephen King is one of, if not the most influential horror writers of the 20th century, and there's actually a book where he gives out writing advice. Now, while it is for any fiction writer, the advice he'll give will be based around horror because that's what he writes. One of the most important points I found in it is to optimize readability. Yes, descriptions are extremely important, and I think that show don't tell is pivotal to horror, but if you write in a way where the majority of people can't understand what you mean, you'll just leave the readers confused, and confusion sucks them out of the immersion. King also advises to avoid ly verbs. For example, he sadly stated, "They can work, but he argues that they go against the show don't tell model. Along with that, if you're not writing a splatter book, don't use too many graphic acts of violence." There's a YouTuber on here that has some amazing points. I'll link her channel in the description. In her horror videos, she brings up a great point of using small but extremely painful acts, like breaking a finger, rather than mass gore. I think especially in books where you need to picture the visuals, small scenes like this work a lot better. Now, I don't read a lot of horror novels, but I have read Frankenstein, and while for me it wasn't too scary, Shelley's descriptions of the monster are a great example of the benefit of imagery. It creates this beautifully grotesque image in my head which works perfectly. This is only achievable from her language. You need to be vivid but not confusing while writing. Now, I'm not going to show them, but my old writing fell into the trap of telling instead of showing, and they fell hard. Rereading them, the main monster featured in one of them made no sense. The language just kind of sucked me out of it. This is the only medium where the reader can visualize everything, and you need to take advantage of it. Now, obviously, there's more mediums than what I mentioned here, and way more hyper-specific advice that I could give. But in general, there's a big overlap with our innate fears and advice that's given to horror creators. Our fears are hard to understand, even more so why we like being scared. But for me, I finally have some understanding of horror.